honeybees, think of them as a tropical superorganism. It's like a warm-blooded animal about the size of a cat. And it has this remarkable trait. During the day, it can dissolve out and send parts of it out over 12 square miles to gather food, and then all recombine back into that organism again. Is that cool, how they do that? But it only can do that in the tropics, where it's warm at night. So I took this picture in Hawaii of a cluster of bees, and they can survive all year round in the warmer parts of California too. They are out in the open. But when they move to colder areas, then they have a problem. Number one, there's no food at certain times of the year, especially if you have a cold winter. So most insects, when the weather gets cold, either die or go into a stage that has a diapause, so an egg that is resistant to cold or a pupa that's resistant to cold. But very few adult insects can survive during cold weather. They are unable to maintain their body temperature to a high enough level that their enzymes continue to work. There's a very few cold-adapted ones that will warm up from time to time to allow their enzymes to work, but enzymes don't work at a different temperature. So only a few eusocial insects, such as ants, termites, and the honeybee, are able to maintain an elevated body temperature during the winter. The honeybees are the best example because they store a carbohydrate fuel. They take the energy of the sun, allow the plants to convert it into carbohydrates. Then they take those carbohydrates, and by combining oxygen with them during the winter, they can release energy. So they take the sun's energy from the summer and release it as heat during the winter. And that's their stored energy source, the honey right there. So what they do is similar to how humans, when we migrated out of Africa as a species, in cold climates, we need to live inside enclosed cavities. We call them houses, or caves, or teepees, or whatever it is. Honeybees are able to live in cavities, natural cavities, such as tree cavities or rock cavities. And they form a cluster there that always stores their food reserves, their carbohydrate reserves, above the brood area. And they yo-yo up and down throughout the year. So when there's excess nectar coming in, they store it as honey up here, and they move the brood nest downward. When there's no nectar coming in and they're using their reserves, then they move the brood nest back upward. If it's cold and they hit the top, they starve to death. Or they die of cold. So winter management, from a beekeeping standpoint, begins in late summer. So it depends upon taking your winter losses in the fall or preparing your colonies for the fall, for the winter. The first thing to do from a bee husbandry standpoint is varroa management. If I take one look at this colony, you can say the chances of this colony surviving the winter are just about zero. It obviously has a bad epidemic of deformed wing virus happening. The pupae are already dying from deformed wing virus, and some of the adults are emerging with deformed wings. So late summer varroa management is the first step towards successful winter management. You got to do it not at the last minute, but before they rear those generations of bees that become what we call winter bees. So the beekeeper that does not treat at all, and you get this high varroa level and a virus epidemic, that colony is going to crash during the winter. If you wait until late in the fall and treat, you may get your mite count down to zero, but it's too late. The virus epidemic has already taken hold, and that colony will not, the winter bees are already infected with deformed wing virus to too high a level. They won't make it through the winter. So you really need to control, in my climate, by mid-August, so that you have at least a month after you've got varroa down to zero for the bees to rear generations of bees free of the deformed wing virus. Only once we have got varroa down to zeroed out, then we will commence stimulation if necessary. Now in my environment, or my dry environment, we need to feed pollen sub. If you have a winter or a fall pollen flow, you don't need to do that at all. I used to move my bees migratory to an area that had a natural pollen flow in fall. I did not need to do supplemental feeding then. If they don't consume that supplemental feed, that pollen patty, what we've learned is you just flip the lid and walk away till next spring. Don't even waste your time. That colony's got an issue that you don't even want to take time dealing with. What happens then, this chart is based upon Lloyd Harris's data from his master's thesis in Manitoba, Canada. So the season kind of similar to yours. And what this does, it shows the age distribution of the worker bees in the hive at any time, going from January to January, where the newly emerged workers, 0 to 12 days old as adults, are red, then 13 to 24 days, 25 to 36 days. Very few live past 48 days during the spring or summer. And then in the winter, you have these long-lived bees out here. So we're talking right now and the dotted line is the amount of brood in the colony, all on this axis. This is 30,000 here, 50,000 here. And you see, as the last of the brood is reared, this is what we're talking about right here. Now, at that time, during the season, again, this is May through January. During the season, the colony gains weight, and then by the end of the season, weight remains stable, slowly starts to decline. But it starts to let the nest temperature drop down in order to conserve stores. Now, this is also colorized by Lloyd himself, and this shows the age cohorts of bees. So he does 12-day cohorts. The reason is you have 12 days as capped brood. So if you go into a hive every 12 days, you can back calculate how many eggs were starting to larvae during that 12-day period. So we called that an age cohort of bees. And this is the end of August, August 31st. This is the first cohort of bees that are not summer bees. These are all cohorts of summer bees, each one of these 12 days older than the last. This would be the oldest cohort here, which are at mean longevity about 35 days. So watch, we get into September. Now we have 2 cohorts here, and as summer bees are all disappearing, 3 cohorts as these last cohorts are emerging. And by the time we get into November, there's almost no bees that ever existed as adults during the summer alive anymore. The bees that then go into winter are these last cohorts that emerged from early September on. Now, when those bees are emerging, those workers emerge, they sniff around. They can immediately tell, oh, we have a queen. They smell queen pheromone. Then they sniff for pollen, presence of incoming fresh pollen, which means that there's a pollen flow outside, and they sniff for the presence of young larval pheromone, E beta osamine, which says there are young larvae that are hungry. They then start to develop, they don't feed on any pollen the first day after emergence. Second day after emergence, all their guts are full of pollen, either incoming pollen or bee bread, or pollen substitute if you've fed that. They need to very quickly build up their protein reserves past what they need, and then they store it in their fat bodies and in their hypopharyngeal glands. If they smell young larvae, they progress to become nurse bees and feed the queen and the larvae and the returning foragers jelly. That's how they distribute the protein throughout the colony. But if they don't smell any young larvae and don't smell incoming pollen, they become arrested nurses, which we call diutinous bees or winter bees. Understand that if you're from middle of California south into Mexico, winter starts in July and ends in November, and spring starts in November. It has nothing to do with day length, not much to do with temperature. It has to do with forage availability. When it dries up in July, there's no pollen coming in, and they go into that diutinous winter state. So forget winter being much about day length. It's not about day length at all. But temperature is a big consideration here. So here's a picture of the fat bodies in the forager bee or the fat bodies in the nurse or winter bees right here. And this is from November 7th, when I was doing an experiment using fluorescent tracer to check what bees were eating when I was feeding pollen sub. I happened to go out when I wasn't feeding any pollen sub, and when they had just gone into winter cluster, I was curious to crush them. So I have a grid of 50 that I can put them on and crush them all and then see what comes out of their guts. Every single bee in the hive had pollen in its guts. Normally, you only see a proportion of them, just the nurse bees with pollen in their guts. So I've been trying for years to convince any other researcher to follow up on this and track the percentage of bees with pollen in their guts over the course of a season. No one's done it, so I started last fall, when we still had pollen coming in, have taken weekly samples of bees all through the winter, and then into the spring, when pollen started coming in, And they're all in the freezer waiting for me to process them this winter and come up with a graph showing what proportion have pollen in their guts. I cannot understand why that's never been published to my knowledge before. You think that would be something that somebody would have thought was important. Okay, now we get to what's called the fall turnover right here. When those adult bees that have ever foraged wear themselves out. If a bee ever flies, that's what causes the death of the bee. Bees are almost immortal for a year. A worker bee is until it starts to fly. Once it starts to fly, it's usually 8 to 12 days, and then it dies. Its wing muscles wear out. As long as they stay in the hive and don't ever fly, they can live for a very long time, up to a year. So what we're seeing is this cohort of bees, all these summer bees, taper off and die, are replaced by these new bees. Now this is some data I got from another study I did, where we looked at a bunch of colonies, took their strength, the number of frames covered with bees in October, in fall, in December, which is the light blue, and then in the January, and then the percent of them that had failed or were tiny next February, ready to go to almonds. And I just sorted by, these are ones that had 18 frames covered with bees in October. These ones had 7 frames covered with bees, and 18, 17, 16 along that line. Here's what I find interesting. The strongest colonies, when you went from the October to December, they were only about half as large. Now this was not actual counted bees. This is frames covered with bees. But the smaller colonies had much less of a decrease. And then if you look at their January, there was not much change on the larger ones. The smaller they get, the more of an increase there was in January. They all seem to be going towards a particular size. We'll return to that. The other thing is the percentage that failed over winter. The red column right here. The smaller they went into winter, the higher a percentage of them failed. Likely, there was a reason why they were small in the fall. They probably had some kind of problem, and that wound up caused their failure. Anyway, this study was not done to do this. This was a different one. We were testing a different product. The other thing is, look at this fairly consistent midwinter cluster size, this blue column. It's pretty close to the same whether they started large or they started small. I find this interesting. We're going to return to that. Now, the colony clusters together to conserve heat. And then they have this, I shifted the dates here. So now we have minimal attrition. If you look at the top of this curve, it's your total number of bees in the hive. So that number goes way down in the fall and then holds very, very steady until they start getting pollen and rearing brood. Once they start rearing brood, those bees have about a 35-day longevity left. So they hold the fort until spring. Now here is what Lloyd, when he collected that data, came up with. He wrote, there is a tendency for colony populations to converge towards a common numerical size. This size appears to aim towards a cluster of 9 to 10 frames in strength in December. The same number that I independently came up with. Jeffrey and Allen in Scotland in 1956 found the optimal cluster size for going into winter appears to be somewhere between 7 and 10 frames covered with bees. What Jeffrey found is when he made supersized colonies that they would overheat. There's too much metabolic heat. It's just like a whale in freezing water. They can only swim fast for a few minutes and then they overheat because they cannot dissipate the heat. So that's how a whaler can chase down a huge whale that they can't exhaust heat. Same with an elephant. An elephant can only run for a couple of minutes, then it overheats. A supersized colony of bees can overheat during the winter just from their basic metabolic rate, especially if they're disturbed. So if you slam the door, a colony might just get enough metabolic heat that they would overheat and die within a few minutes. So fall management. First, what we like to do, this is typically, we winter in our California climate where we do get some snow during the winter in a double deep. We don't do the singles. You can do it in singles. But that's too much work for us the next spring when we want to go to almonds because they will starve in almonds in the springtime if you winter in a single. So what we want ideally is the upper box full of honey and the lower box with the cluster in it. I want to be able to pop the lid and not see any bees at all looking down. I want them to be down in the lower box. That gives them that room to yo-yo up into that honey and not starve in the winter. So we want a colony to weigh about 130 pounds, so that's the 65 pounds on the tip on the front. We call it a two-finger tip. One finger you can lift with, that's too light. 3 fingers, that's more than you need. 2 fingers, that's just right. Then the other thing is it helps colonies a lot to provide top insulation. If you see this, that means they are losing excessive heat out of the top. If they're losing heat out of the top, that means that top is too cool and you're going to get condensation under the lid and your cluster will get wet from dripping warm water. We're going to return to insulation. Here's my 2 sons. We do an oxalic acid dribble once the colonies go broodless. We have done this for many, many years. We personally prefer that to vaporization, but vaporization can also work. It's just that this is more efficacious. And we do it very, very quickly. We use a garden sprayer and a gentle stream at the rate of 1 second per 5 milliliters. Let's go 1, chimpanzee 1, chimpanzee 2, chimpanzee 3. So it takes 10 seconds to dribble a 10-frame colony very quickly. 10-frame cluster. Then this is my place during the winter. This is how we used to get this every winter. Lately, we have not been getting these kind of winters. We did this last winter. We got even more snow than that. But we do get winter there at my place. And we just leave them alone. Now, the winter cluster looks like a solid ball of bees. But if you give them a puff of smoke, you can see that was a tropical environment in the middle. And these bees don't move at all because they were cold. So you have this mantle of cold bees surrounding a cluster of warm bees in the middle. And Farrar, back in 1944, dissected colonies, killed them, froze them, and showed what happened here. The main thing is this mantle of bees, that outer mantle, must come in contact with honey somewhere in order to be able, because they don't move hardly at all. And I've yet to find any researcher who's studied how that honey is transferred to those almost immobile bees that are doing the heat on the outside. That's another whole avenue of research that I've not seen studied. When I've looked at it, I've wondered, well, how much heat is lost by radiation transfer through the honey? So I went out on a cold morning and put a probe right here in the honey, just outside the bees, another probe right at the edge of the cluster right there. And you can see there's a big difference in temperature. So that means there's not much heat transferring through the honey away from the cluster. So they're able to maintain that heat without losing it to the honey. Now here's the interesting thing. The Canadians often winter bees clusters with no open cell left. Every single cell full of sugar syrup to go into the winter, which means that you have a 1-inch layer of honey and 5/16 of an inch of bees, and then a 1-inch layer of honey, all not in contact with each other. And yet somehow that whole cluster keeps this honey chilled down to, I don't want to get it off. I think it's around 5 degrees. I'll show you the temperatures in a minute. And then this can get chilled out here. But I find this interesting too. It's not critical to have any open combs at all in the middle. Now, if we look at the metabolic rate of resting bees, okay, that are not active, the mantle bees at the very low temperature, here's your temperature right here, so yeah, 10 degrees C. At 10 degrees C, they have the highest metabolic rate of any bee in the hive. Okay, that's not being a heater bee, which we'll return to. These are resting bees, not heat generator bees. The bees in the brood nest, where it's warm, 35°C, have a much lower metabolic rate. So in that cluster, when it's not disturbed, it's those very cold bees on the outside that have the highest resting metabolic rate. And when Stabenthaler then took thermographs of it, this would be a heater bee right here. So of the mantle bees at 0 degrees C, about 10% of them were producing heat. 90% at any moment were not producing heat. Now here's the way bees produce heat. They produce the heat from their thoracic flight muscles. So they disconnect their wings and they vibrate, and you can't see the vibration, and that's how they are heat. You can tell whether, you gotta understand, to a honeybee, oxygen is a poison. If they were to breathe like we did, they would die from oxygen poisoning. So a bee only takes a breath about once a minute when it's resting, otherwise it would die from oxygen poisoning. If a bee is breathing using oxygen, you can tell because their abdomen will be pulsing. That's how they breathe. So if a bee's abdomen is not pulsing, it is not breathing. So when a bee starts to produce heat, you can see its abdomen pulsing, and they produce the heat here. Their bloodstream goes through this aorta, forward. They have multiple hearts, and they push that heat to the forehead. That way, when they're flying, they can use their forehead as a radiator to dump heat. Otherwise, they would cook when they are flying in warm weather. Then that blood circulates back here. Now, if they need to get cooled, they can pump it into their abdomen for cooling. Otherwise, they shunt that and bring it right back up here, up to the thorax, for that regeneration. So if they want to heat a larva, they just put their head in the cell, vibrate their wing muscles, and they can produce heat in their forehead, and that's how a heater bee works. If they want to kill a wasp, they can surround it, put their foreheads in, generate heat, and they can cook that wasp by putting their foreheads against it. Okay, now, as the bee starts to chill, to produce that heat, that vibration, you have to have a synchrony between your contraction and your relaxation. And they can do that very well until the temperature drops down to about 10 degrees C. At 10 degrees C, they can no longer synchronize those contractions of their muscles, and they go into chill coma. At that point, the bee can no longer move its muscles, and if it doesn't warm up somehow, it's going to die. So you never see any bees in the colony getting down below that temperature, that chill coma temperature. So what the mantle bees do, they are all head in, they are tight packed, so no air transfer escapes. They keep their heads above 10 degrees, and they allow their abdomens to chill below 10 degrees. So they all have warm heads and cold butts right there. So what they're doing is, all these are facing in, they have a countercurrent flow. Heat wants to radiate out from the cluster, but they're continually pumping the blood back towards the center. So as that heat tries to radiate out, they're pumping blood back in. So that keeps that heat trapped in the cluster by active circulation. Isn't that cool? Okay, now, on the bees in the core, when they looked at that right there, about 15% of them at any moment are producing heat. It's not always the same bees, and you can see the bright glow of the ones that are producing heat. Those hot bees rotate out to the core of the mantle from time to time, and the mantle have to rotate in to allow their enzymes to work. At 50 degrees, many of their metabolic enzymes cannot work, so they have to go into that core cluster, warm up, let the enzymes do their job, and then they can rotate back out to the mantle again. Okay, and here's, you can see the heating right here. Now listen to these figures. When a bee is at, brood nest temperature is about 35 degrees. When they are flying, it goes up quite a bit. Stammthaler found that some get clear up to 47 degrees. 47 degrees, those heater bees. So they can generate heat at a higher rate than any other organism. That's more than a hummingbird. Incredible heat generation. Okay, so now let's move away from individual bees. Let's look at the entire cluster during the winter. Okay, so here's your metabolic rate, your watts per kilogram of bees for the whole cluster. At 5 degrees C, the cluster uses the least amount of energy when it's cold. If it gets any colder, the amount of energy per minute or per hour increases, okay? So if you're overwintering bees in a closed storage, which many North American and Canadian beekeepers do, they all put their cold storage units right at 4 degrees C. 4 degrees C is minimal heat use by an intact cluster, okay? Then if they start to warm up a little bit, they actually increase their metabolic rate, peaking at about 20 degrees C. So when they're trying to rear brood in the late winter, early springtime, that's the highest metabolic rate of the cluster, which is why you don't have bees starve during the winter. They starve in the late winter, early spring when they start trying to rear brood. Once they get up to 30 degrees C outside, that metabolic rate drops way down, and they're close to perfect temperature, and they no longer have to produce much heat. Now let's get to moisture and ventilation. And I like this. This is from Mabus, 1998. He said, many of the arguments given to back up any recommendations, this is what you're going to hear from all kinds of beekeepers, all kinds of books, those recommendations, for providing more and more top ventilation are based on reasoned considerations and anthropomorphic thinking, rather than the sharp-eyed observations of bee behavior. Bees have been doing this a lot longer than humans, okay? And now we step in and say, oh no, we need to do something different. What do the bees do right here? Why don't we let the bees show us what they've learned over millions of years of evolution? They want top insulation over the hive. They want a waterproof varnish inside the hive. So they do not want moisture absorption in the hive. They cover the inside with propolis, okay? And they want a relatively small entrance. They like it. They don't always get it in a hollow tree, but they like it near the bottom, and they keep a small entrance, okay? The advantage of a vertical hive, as following what Mike Palmer, is Mike in here? Okay, what Mike Palmer showed with his vertical, his two queen systems, is that bees are adapted for skinny vertical cavities. So his system makes perfect sense on that. So that it's very easy to keep that small amount of heat that rises. Now, that heat rising, there's very little air that escapes, very little heat, but any that does tends to rise. Okay, here's a good question for you. Which is more dense, moisture-saturated air or dry air? Moisture-saturated air is less dense, okay, because water has a lower molecular weight. So any ventilation, moisture-saturated air wants to rise beside it being warm. So any that does escape the cluster will rise up here, but that heats that honey right above so that cluster can move up. If you have horizontal hives, it's difficult, more difficult for those colonies to move horizontally. So I was up in Germany recently, and they all have these horizontal hives with the cluster at one end. That makes it harder for the bees to move sideways into that honey. So for winter feeding, one of the problems is excess water. If there's excess water in the winter feed, the bees can't fly out to defecate, their guts get full, and they can cause dysentery inside the hive. So you want to avoid adding extra moisture. So you can feed either a large sugar crystal block or just plain granulated sugar, pour it over newspaper, works very well, or more expensive fondants or home recipes. Protein, a little bit of protein is nice. They need a small amount for muscle repair during the winter, but they don't need very much during the winter. The winter cluster now. So I drew this right here. You have an insulating shell that is around that 10 degrees temperature. The inside depends. They can drop it down, into the 20s unless they're rearing brood, and then they heat it back up. Now here's the key thing. The oxygen content of this can drop from 21%, which you are breathing right now, down to about 15%. Is that cluster airtight or what? If the oxygen content drops and the carbon dioxide content goes from a third of a percent up to about 5%, you guys would all die breathing that air inside there. That tells you there's not much ventilation out of a cluster if the gas contents change. And during the summer, when it's hot, they ventilate out the top. During the winter, they don't. They force ventilate at the bottom. So any moisture that comes out does not come necessarily out of the top. They avoid that. The moisture is forced out the bottom. Okay? What you have then is around this cluster right here, you have that bees do not try to heat this area at all. They don't try to heat the cavity. But there is radiative loss of heat, and that warms a little bit of a bubble of slightly warmed air around the cluster. That prevents the condensation from happening up there if you have enough insulation over the top. Then the bees tell you something about what size winter entrance they want. Do they want a screened bottom board during the winter? No. They will close off that entrance given free choice. They want very little ventilation during the winter. So you can put on an entrance reducer that will block the rodents and much of the wind and stuff. So now we get into metabolic water, condensation, and insulation. Three very contentious topics among beekeepers. So when you metabolically burn sugar with oxygen, it's a simple formula. So for every molecule of sugar, you bring in 6 molecules of oxygen, you wind up with 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. A colony typically consumes about a pound of honey per week. That generates the metabolic amount of moisture of 1 cup of water from this equation. Now, the honey already has 17% moisture in it, so if you add that, that means for every pound of honey, there's about a cup and a quarter of water produced in the hive that has to go somewhere. It starts in their bodies, so they either can hold it or they can breathe it out. We'll talk about that in a moment. So if they breathe it out, if you do the arithmetic yourself, or I saved you time, I did it for you right here. If I calculate it out, at the temperature of the outside of the cluster, that there's about 800 times expansion of water when it goes from liquid to vapor. So that means if they exhale it as water vapor, you have per hour on a wintering colony about 1.4 liters of volume of water vapor per hour being exhausted. That means the colony, if you sealed it up to a tiny opening, without any kind of fanning, it would have 1.25 liters of water vapor exiting every hour, day and night. So a colony continually breathes out that excess water vapor if it can breathe it out. If they hold it inside, then their guts get full of water and they will get dysentery. Now, let's look at the cluster. This would be the center of the cluster with centimeters away from the cluster. This would be your carbon dioxide content. In the center of the cluster, the carbon dioxide content is very high. You get out to the bees out on the periphery, it drops down very low. On the other hand, look at relative humidity. The bees out on the outside in the mantle, they have saturated air. Okay, it's that dew point out there. Inside, it is very dry. So the bees in the center of the cluster are thirsty bees. The bees on the outside have excess water. I was at the bee yard the other day and I saw some hives tipped backwards, but they had screen bottom boards. If I had a hive tipped backwards in California and went to winter, they'll all be dead. If you get water pooling on the bottom board, colonies die in my area. So every hive has to be tipped forward so the water will drain out. Now, larger clusters get thirsty during the winter, especially if they start rearing any brood. They get desperately thirsty, and Tom Seeley came out to Scotland and said, well, they'll fly at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever the heck that is in centigrade, very below flight temperature, and they will often die because the water gatherers are desperate for water. Thirsty colonies. Even when it's raining, colonies get very thirsty if they're rearing brood. Here's what bees do. There's also a benefit to recapturing the heat of condensation. So when water goes from vapor stage to liquid phase, vapor phase to liquid phase, it gives off a tremendous amount of heat. If you have a top ventilation, that heat of vaporization is lost to the atmosphere. If there's no top ventilation, the water changes phase from vapor to liquid down here, and the heat of vaporization goes back into the cluster. When I do the calculations, that's about 12% of the calories in honey. So if you have top ventilation, you lose 12% of the calories that the bees store for the honey. You're taking their precious stores and you're putting it out and wasting it. Now, water bottle bees normally go to where there's condensation, and they gather that and take it in to those thirsty bees in the center, and they share that water with them. So condensation within the hive is very beneficial to the bees if it takes place in the right place. So the concept here is you want to have your cavity size proportional to the cluster size. So a small cluster in a large cavity, you're going to get condensation on the top. If you have the cavity proportional to the cluster, then you have the slightly warmed air here if you have insulation here, and all the condensation happens at the bottom. The people who use the polystyrene hives, like in Sweden and stuff, that's what they find, that if you put in aluminum plates and trap the condensation, there's none at the top. It's all at the bottom of the hive. And here are photographs taken from hives where somebody put a glass plate over the top of them. If it's uninsulated, yes, you get condensation above the bees, and it drops down on them. They can't get wet. But if you put insulation over the top, there's no condensation over the top of the cluster. It all goes off to the side. And again, with top insulation, you can see where the condensation happens. It's not over the top of the cluster because it's warmer there. If you see any kind of snow melt on top, you're going to get condensation above the cluster. Okay, very easy to see. One thing that people misunderstand, they think putting a bunch of straw or blankets or something on top of the hive will help them for insulation. If it absorbs any moisture, it doesn't work as insulation anymore. So if you're going to put straw or blankets, put them in a plastic bag so they do not absorb moisture. Then they retain their insulative value. Okay, so it's all about the dew point. So the bodies of the mantle bees are colder than the dew point temperature of the air of inside. So theoretically, we should be seeing condensation on these bees, but we don't see that. I'm not sure why, whether they just lick it off fast or what it is. That needs more study also. You think with all of us worrying about winter survival, we'd have more study of some of these very basic principles. I'm always surprised. So this is in North America, what your average winter dew point temperature is. So depending on where you live, if you're in a humid area or a dry area, if you're up in Alberta, Canada, your colonies are going to get thirsty as hell during the winter because the dew point is at such a low temperature. If you're somewhere where, like here, where your dew point will be much higher temperature, then you have more problems with condensation inside the hive. So right here, this is in Fahrenheit, I made this here, where your dew point is, you can see this is dew points right here, how it drops off down here. This is from Owens in 1971. So if you go back to what your dew point temperature is, that's where the condensation will be from any outside air that comes into the hive. Okay, entrances, or entrance. So the bees are telling us something. They don't like much of an entrance during the winter. Underneath snow, if the snow is dry, it's fine. That exiting warm air coming out will make a bubble that will give them enough air transfer. They need to just get rid of the carbon dioxide. If it's wet snow, then they can actually clog off the entrance. So imagine you're in your own house. You're in a cold climate. You live in a 2-story house, okay? Would you want to open the front door and open the top window in that house? So why do people want to do that in their beehive? I don't understand it. You would never do that to your children, but you do that to your beehive. So this is Carolyn Gout. I actually had dinner with him just recently. Drew these nice pictures. These are on my website showing what happens when you have top ventilation, that you lose that little bit of warm air up there, and you really disrupt everything the colony wants to do. That's why they will often propolize up that top entrance. Now, bees with too much water in their gut, they are desperate to get rid of that water. So they will try to fly out, and the moment they get their head out, they just let it go. We call that dysentery when you see it on the side of the hive. These are bees flying out, trying to poop, and many of them chill and don't make it back. So you want to try to avoid dysentery in the hive. One of the things also when they want to fly, if they have to go down over ice-cold combs, they don't want to leave that cluster. So there may be an advantage of having a midway up entrance reducer if you have a multiple stacked hive. That wouldn't be the case for you guys if you have single stories. But if you're up in Canada where you may have a 3-story hive to give them enough honey to make it through the winter, you may want to make your entrance maybe midway up. So, and if you're in an area where you might get hard freezing across the bottom, where they can't get ventilation, like Mike Palmer, then he does do an entrance to give them an upper flight escape. So right here, something like this, that would be a reasonable answer. And you saw Mike closes off the top ones, and he does a midway entrance. Up in Canada, beekeepers often do this. They put a wind guard over the entrance so that strong winds don't blow into the hive. And ideally, what you'd do, you'd pack 4 hives together, insulate the top, wrap them around, and give them all midway entrance. This would probably be the ideal configuration for hives in cold winter areas. I just got back from British Columbia, where they line up nukes similarly, side by side, 20 on a table, backwards and forwards, insulation top and bottom, and they winter nukes over the winter there that way, sharing the heat. Now, nosema, this is a photograph I took of a bee's midgut. This is the tracheal breathing tube. These are the striations of the midgut tissue. Every white oval is a nosema spore. Their guts are can be full of nosema. Another misconception commonly in the books is that nosema causes dysentery. There has never been any published evidence ever that nosema of either Nosema apis or Nosema serenity causes dysentery. On the other hand, there's very strong published research that shows that neither Nosema apis nor Nosema serenity has ever caused dysentery. So the books just parrot this misconception. Now, dysentery, if it happens in the hive, will transmit Nosema spores, but it's not the Nosema that caused the dysentery. You can only diagnose Nosema via microscopy. Here's a photograph I took with pollen grains, a typical bee hair, a setae. They're not actually hairs, they're setae, which is very different. And then these are Nosema cerani. You can see the elongation means it's not Nosema apis. If you've looked at enough spores, you can easily tell Nosema cerani from Nosema apis. And the thing is, if you look at Nosema spore counts from the foragers, you're going to be misled. If you look at them instead, the percentage of bees from inside the hive actually infected, it's a much more even curve. Once you get up to about 4 bees or more out of 10 infected, then it becomes a problem. Now, as far as Nosema causing winter losses, there's a number of published studies, many of them from Canada, some from Switzerland here. Every one says no correlation between winter losses and Nosema cerani. So if you're concerned about Nosema in your hives going to winter, that's up to you if you want to worry about something that's nothing to worry about. Okay, then back to the midwinter initiation of brood rearing. So Lloyd Harris found he took his colonies on the 5th of December up in Manitoba, Canada. Very, very cold. Temperatures 11 to 26 degrees, negative 11 to negative 26 degrees centigrade. Cold enough, right? He picked them up to put them in cold storage. 17 of the 21 colonies contained pupae when he did that. Those bees were rearing brood during those cold temperatures. What he said, after cold storage by March, approximately 50% of the colony's populations had been reared in August, September, or October, and the rest during the winter. The other 50% had been reared during the winter. The stronger colonies coming out of cold storage had reared half their population during the winter. One of his colonies, the strongest one, actually came out of the winter cold storage stronger with more bees than it went into cold storage during the winter. So this winter brood rearing is important. Jeffrey, again, found winter brood rearing in Scotland. Okay? Now, one of the problems in many areas, they go into the winter with very little bee bread. That means you don't have the protein to rear those bees. So it's important to try to winter your colonies with some natural pollen in there. Otherwise, you may have to do some supplemental feeding of pollen during the, or pollen sub during the winter. So why, other than population, would they engage in winter brood rearing? It may be to avoid dysentery, their guts full of water. One of the things is if you have honey that crystallizes, that means you start off with 87% moisture, or sugar, but when it crystallizes, that's closer to 100%, which means this is less, has more water in it proportionally. That is so wet that it can cause dysentery because between the metabolic water and that water coming in, their guts get full of water. If they start rearing brood, what it does is it increases that temperature, allows them to ventilate that out during their breathing. When the temperature is cold, they cannot exhale. It won't go into the vapor stage. Now, when I do the calculations of winter brood rearing, those bees are able to absorb that moisture out of their guts back into their bloodstream and then put it into their glands in order to put it into the jelly. Jelly is about 70% water. When I do the calculations, the rearing of a single larva would allow more than 3 workers to completely dispose of the excess water in their bodies. In order for the cluster to transfer the water produced from a weekly consumption of a pound of honey, when I did the calculations, the colony would need to rear less than half a frame, a Langstroth frame of brood, on both sides of that comb, so this big an area per week. That would use up all that excess metabolic water. There's a paper in the American Bee Journal years ago by Mebus and Omhold that said, this is probably why one reason why bees rear brood during the winter, and I've yet to see anybody follow up on that. There's another burning avenue of research that needs to be done. So the other thing is that in areas where you have a very cold winter, okay, and the colonies are dry, there's not enough moisture for them to rear brood. So that may be the limiting factor for brood rearing, is that they're simply too dry inside. So when you talk about condensation in metabolic water, it's a little more complicated than some people make it out to be. Okay, so they need a lot of protein to rear the winter brood. So the best wintering can be bred. Now, this is us moving to almond pollination. The growers like us to get our bees down there before the almond trees bloom. They call us up and say, okay, because they don't trust that the beekeeper is going to bring them down, okay? Our regular growers that we've been with for years, they trust us. But we go, we have our bees in the foothills right now on a nectar and pollen flow building up. And you want us to move them down into this desert right now? There's nothing in bloom down there before the almond trees come to bloom. In a week, this is going to be solid white with bloom. But right there's a desert. So we move them down and then give them a kilo of pollen sub so they continue to rear brood while they're sitting there waiting for these trees to bloom. When we do that, so this is one I took in December. Every bee had a gut full of the pollen sub that we fed in midwinter. So they are happy to eat that protein in midwinter. Okay, then we get our first pollens coming in the springtime. This is, for us, this is alder tree pollen. And we found out, even though the books all say the pollens coming from wind-pollinated trees is not complete nutrition, I beg to differ. This is what even when I run trials where I starve colonies intentionally for protein in my feeding trials, when this alder blooms, they rear beautiful combs of brood. It's complete nutrition at least with the alder pollen. So again, one thing I've done is I found there's so many parroted misinformation in the bee books. It just makes me sick that people write stuff that they don't have any evidence to write. They're just repeating what somebody else said. Okay, then we get, I love this quote, any fool can keep bees until the end of December. The tricky part is getting them through early spring. Okay, and this is why. So this is the date of emergence down here of these winter bees. Summer bees have a very short, this is longevity, 100% longevity to 0. They have very short longevity. When they go into winter cluster, they have long longevity until they start rearing brood. Once they start rearing brood, boom, their longevity drops off. And Al Abitabli wrote this over the months, showing how the adult bee population drops as the amount of brood goes up. So when we look here, look at the proportion of, this is eggs, larvae, and pupae. This is adult bees. You're going to have 3 times as many bees in the immature stage as you have adult bees to care for them. That's really stressful. And we call this the spring turnover right here, when these bees all die off and they have to raise their replacements. And if you get a snowfall or rainfall right here, it can be disastrous. So here's a colony in February, looking beautiful. These are all geriatric old bees. This is their last chance to replace themselves right here. And then we get an unexpected weather. This would be at my home yard. This happens like in April, sometimes even in May. So they're in full buildup and full of brood, and then you get this coming in. And the colonies immediately go into starvation mode. So if you're not out there, and people go, Randy, you're out there working bees, feeding bees when it's snowing and raining? I said, yeah, duh, because when it's warm and sunny, they feed themselves. Your job as a beekeeper is to keep care of your livestock. So we go out there in our foul weather gear and we are feeding our bees when these cold events happen. Now here's my 2 sons out here enjoying what was a warm spring day and a nectar flow. Every other hive of the beekeepers in our club all starved to death during this. Ours were the only ones that survived because we got out there and we worked when this unexpected snow came in. Pollen sub can really help, and I have friends in California, midwinter, they grow these huge colonies prior to almond pollination, and they shake thousands of pounds of bees out of their hives in January to sell them to other beekeepers, all on feeding pollen sub in the middle of winter.
I would just like to ask about open mesh floors, which we tend to use in the UK, and you were talking about the heat. Do you have closed floors on your hives?
When open mesh floors first became popular, brought up in the United States, we were one of the first we built 500 of them and brought them into our operation, ran them, thinking they'd be a benefit for one thing or another. We're phasing them all out of our operation. We have not found them in our operation to be a benefit. If you close them off, for almond pollination, if you have open mesh floor, the cluster goes up way higher. They won't use those lower combs because of the wind and the cold down there. We don't want that. It adds, if there's any wind exposure with them, it adds to the stress. Do they need the ventilation? I think I just showed, no. Do the bees like them? No, they'll propolis them up. So they're trying to tell you something. If you want to listen to your bees, when they close up with propolis, they're trying to tell you something. So I'll let the bees answer for you.
I insulate the top of my house, but I also insulate the sides because I don't think the wood is good enough. Do you think the wood is good enough?
It depends upon what your outside temperature is. So in my area, no. Yes, in my area, the wood appears to be good enough. If I were living up in Alaska, I would insulate the sides.
Okay.
You mentioned that when the bees fly out, they tend to die. Is that because...
They don't tend to die, they may die.
May die.
Okay, and they may be altruistic self-removal. They may be sick. Notice that during the summer, very few bees ever die within the hive. There's a reason for that. Evolutionarily, bees that died within the hive put more work on their sisters to haul their bodies out. And if they're diseased, more exposure of the pathogen to their sisters. So evolutionarily, bees will use their last remaining energy if they feel sick or old to fly out and die outside the hive. That's why there's very few bees ever die within the hive. During the winter, it may be an advantage to give them an exit that they can do that. So those were bees that never intended to return back. Now, on the other hand, there are bees that fly out for dysentery, or on the other hand, if they need water, they're water foragers, they may get chilled and not be able to get back. That's inadvertent chilling. So that happens with the water foragers a lot.
Okay, so the second part is if the winter bees can survive up to 6 months, and then obviously when spring comes, they'll die out. Is that because they tend to have used up all their energy, or
No.
No? Okay.
No, what caused the bee to shift off from being a nurse bee is the replacement bees that are emerging from the comb. They then there was a very recent article, a paper published on this, they call them the teenage bees, that the bees will continue. You can make a bee be a nurse for 3 months. They will live as a nurse almost indefinitely until emerging bees take their place, shift them up into being mid-age bees. Then they remain this mid-age bees, this reserve workforce. They produce beeswax, they do cleaning, they do guarding, they do standby as soldier bees until the feedback of the ethyl oleate pheromone from the forager bees. So forager bees, when the bees are engaged in foraging, they produce a pheromone, ethyl oleate, which suppresses the transition of the mid-age bees into foraging. So when the amount of ethyl oleate decreases, that tells some mid-age bees, oh, it's time for us to go from mid-age to foraging. At that point, that's a limited liability or limited warranty. They're going to live for 8 to 12 days and they're going to be dead. So they can live almost forever until they get pushed off the brood combs and then the signal to start foraging, and then they will die. So that turnover in the spring is because there's very few foragers left in the hive. So that first round of brood that emerges, the bees that were the diutinous winter bees, after they're done nursing, they go immediately into foraging. And in the almonds, they'll do that and wear themselves out in just a couple of days, and you see a colony crash because there was not enough sealed brood left to take the place of them. Does that answer your question? The other thing is, I warn people, if anybody gives you a short answer to any beekeeping question, they don't have depth of knowledge.
You've described a lot of environmental things that are affecting the lifespan of the bees, but certainly we've been told that the queen lays biologically different eggs that live longer over the winter. Do you have evidence for one?
I have not seen any convincing evidence that the eggs make any difference. It's what makes a difference. Okay, any fertilized egg, the default is to become a male bee. Only if that fertilized egg had a different allele at the sex determination gene, two different alleles, then it will activate the gene feminize, which then takes it off male development and become a female bee. So that's why a diploid drone becomes a male, because it has the same allele on both. Okay, so the default is to become a male. If there's two alleles are different, then you become a female. Then it depends epigenetically on how that larva is fed. If they're fed copious high-fat jelly and lots of sugar, they will become a normal female, a queen bee. The queen bee is the only normal female bee in the hive. The unusual bees are the workers. The queen is the only normal female in the hive, a fertile reproductive female. Okay, people go, oh, the queen bee is special. No, there's nothing special about the queen bee. It's the infertile worker bees that are the special bees in the hive. They are starved queen bees.
Going back one question, can you artificially extend the life of the worker bees by feeding them blocks of fondant, or will they default to foraging?
You can artificially extend the life of a bee by removing the sealed brood. That way they never get pushed off the brood combs, and they will remain nurses for a very, very long time. The other way is to prevent them from foraging. If they don't forage, they can live. Lloyd Harris, whose dad it was, he emailed me a couple of years ago, Randy, 350 days, longest worker bee he had recorded so far of a marked worker bee, 350 days of life. They can live a very long time until they start to fly.